She laughed in Maris's face the morning it all began. Not a polite laugh. Not the kind a person tries to smother with their hand. Margaret Holt threw her head back and let it rip, loud, sharp, cutting right across the dusty road between them, while the other women standing outside Greer's supply store watched and did nothing. Nothing at all. "You paid actual money for that mud hole?" Margaret said, loud enough for every soul on that street to hear. "Harlan, come listen to this. The widow's girl just bought the Decker Hollow." Her husband stepped out from the store, thumbs tucked in his suspenders, and when Margaret told him the price Maris had paid, he started laughing too. Then the Greer boy. Then old Sid Pulver, who hadn't smiled since his barn burned 3 winters back. Maris Rowan stood there in the middle of that street holding the deed with both hands, a crumpled paper she had carried for 2 days straight without letting go, and she felt every single one of those laughs land on her like thrown stones. She did not run. She did not cry. Not there. But her hands were shaking. She hoped nobody noticed. If you've ever had someone laugh at the most important decision of your life, you already know exactly how Maris felt standing on that street. And if you've ever turned out to be right, when everyone was so sure you were wrong, then stay with us. Because what happened next on that dried-up hollow in the Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1887 is the kind of story that doesn't let go. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss one of these stories. They travel far. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this one reaches. And if something in this story moves you, tap that like button. It helps more people find us. Now, let's go back to that deed. And the mud. And the woman everyone was absolutely certain had lost her mind. Maris Rowan was 26 years old, which in 1887 Wyoming meant she was already considered past the easy years. Her mother had died the previous November. Fever, fast and merciless, leaving Maris with a small cedar box of saved coins, a mule named Percy, and 40 acres of land that her mother had somehow held the option on for 11 years without telling anyone why. The deed was the only thing her mother left that wasn't worn out. Maris had found it tucked inside an old Bible, folded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. She'd sat on the edge of her mother's bed for a long time that night, holding it in the lamplight, trying to understand why a practical woman, a woman who counted every penny twice and never spent one without cause, had kept a claim on the worst piece of ground in Callaway County. She never found a letter explaining it. No note, no reason, just the deed, and the coordinates, and the word hollow written in her mother's careful hand across the back. So Maris went to see it herself. What she found was 40 acres of clay hardpan surrounded by low hills, a scattering of dry bunch grass, and at the center of it all, a shallow depression, maybe 60 feet across, maybe less, filled with brown water so thick with silt it barely looked like water at all. More mud than pond. The kind of place a person walks past and feels their mood drop a little without knowing why. A crow sat on a dead juniper at the edge of it and stared at her. Maris stared back. She spent 2 full hours walking that property. She poked the banks of the muddy basin with a stick. She scraped the sole of her boot across the clay. She knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the earth in several places, feeling for moisture, testing the density of the packed ground beneath the dry surface layer. Then she saw the tracks. Fresh ones, pressed into the wet margin at the edge of the mud. Small, 3-toed, the webbing still clear in the softest patches. Duck tracks. More than one bird. And they were made that morning. The mud was barely dry around the edges. Maris crouched there for a long time. She was not a woman who made decisions without thinking. She was not naive. She had watched her mother scrimp and calculate and sacrifice for 30 years, watched her father break himself against poor soil before a bad winter took him when Maris was 9. She knew exactly what hardship looked like. She knew the smell of land that had nothing left to give. But she also knew something else that most people standing on that hollow would not have thought to notice. Ducks do not stop at dead water. She paid the claim fees the next morning. The Callaway Valley, in the summer of 1887, was a place held together mostly by stubbornness and shared suffering. There were 11 homestead families within riding distance of the town of Greer, a cluster of weathered buildings along a road that turned to mud in spring and cracked iron hard by July. The settlers there had come from places like Missouri and Tennessee and northern Ohio, carrying seeds and tools and the particular kind of hope that only people who had nothing left could afford to carry. Most of them were decent people. Most of them worked hard. But the valley had a way of compressing people. When the soil gave you nothing after months of labor, when the wells dropped and the creeks narrowed and the sky stayed white and merciless for weeks, something in people's patience wore thin. They laughed at things that weren't funny. They got small in their thinking. They said, "At least it's not me," when they watched someone else struggle. That was the valley Maris Rowan moved into alone. She set up her camp on the northeast edge of the hollow, where the ground was slightly higher, not because the view was any good, it wasn't, but because that corner got the morning shade from a limestone rise before the worst heat of the day. She built a one-room structure from rough lumber she bought in Greer and hauled out on Percy's back, 2 trips, the mule making his feelings about the arrangement perfectly clear both times. Her nearest neighbor was a man named Dale Birch, a wheat farmer with 7 children and a permanent squint from years of scanning skies that disappointed him. His property ran along the south edge of the hollow. The first time he saw Maris out there, she was elbow-deep in the mud bank, digging. He pulled his horse up at the property line and watched her for a moment. "What exactly are you doing?" he finally said. Maris wiped her forearm across her face, which accomplished nothing except moving the mud around. "Deepening the basin," she said. Dale Birch looked at the shallow, muddy pond. He looked at her hand spade. He looked at the bucket she was using to haul silt. He had the expression of a man watching someone dig a hole to china. "That's going to take a while," he said. "I know." "Why?" Maris thought about how to answer that in a way that wouldn't invite more questions. "I want more water in it," she said. Dale stared at her a moment longer. Then he shook his head slowly, clicked his tongue at his horse, and rode back toward his own place. He told his wife that evening that the Rowan girl had gone peculiar. His wife nodded and said she'd heard as much from the women in town. Maris was not peculiar. She was calculating. What she understood, and what nobody in the valley had the patience to think through, was a simple fact about water in a drought year. Shallow water evaporates fast. A basin that's 6 inches deep in July becomes a damp smear by August. But deep in that same basin to 3 or 4 feet, pack the clay walls tight to reduce seepage and widen the margins to catch whatever rain came through. And you change the math entirely. She had read about it. She had read about a lot of things. Her mother had believed, against the conventions of their time, that a woman should read anything she could get her hands on, and Maris had taken that instruction seriously. She'd found an agricultural pamphlet in a Kansas City lending library about water retention in arid climates. She'd read it twice before returning it. Then she'd borrowed a surveyor's guide and a soil manual from a sympathetic librarian who probably assumed she was researching for a husband. She wasn't. She was researching for herself. So when she began reshaping that muddy basin with a hand spade and a bucket and nothing else, she wasn't guessing. She knew what she was doing. She just couldn't explain it to people who had already decided she was wrong. That was the loneliest part. Not the hard labor, not the heat, not the mud packed under her fingernails so deep she'd stopped trying to clean it out. It was the certainty she carried around in a valley full of people who were certain about other things. You can be confident and still feel very much alone. She dug for 3 weeks before she let herself stop and look at what she'd made. The basin was deeper now, maybe 4 feet at center. She'd cut the banks at gentle angles so they wouldn't erode and slump back in after the first rain. She'd packed the lowest sections of the clay wall with a mallet she'd made from a green juniper branch, tamping it solid until the seepage nearly stopped. She'd hauled water from Birch Creek, 1.5 miles on foot, 2 buckets at a time, until her shoulders ached so deep she could feel it in her teeth. The pond held. Not beautifully. There was still silt, still a brownish color to the water, still stretches of the bank that were more mud than anything solid. But it held. And it was deeper than anyone else's water source for miles. Maris sat at the edge of it one evening, her boots off, her feet in the mud, eating a biscuit she'd cooked that morning. Percy stood nearby. She looked at the water for a long time. Then, just at the edge of dusk, she heard the sound she'd been waiting for. Wings. 2 mallards came in low over the limestone rise to the north, banked once over the hollow, and landed in the center of her pond with a flat, splashing sound that broke the silence like a snapped stick. Maris sat perfectly still. The ducks righted themselves and began moving through the water, heads dipping, completely at ease, as if they'd been coming to this exact spot for years. She exhaled slowly, said nothing. Percy turned his head toward the water and flicked one ear. That was the night Maris Rowan herself believed she hadn't made a terrible mistake. She was not prepared for how much the valley would fight her on it. The mocking had started early, before the pond was even finished, back when she was still hauling buckets from the creek, and people could see her coming and going along the road with that yoke across her shoulders. But after the word got out that she wasn't planting crops, wasn't even trying, wasn't even turning soil, something in the tone shifted. It wasn't just laughing anymore. It had an edge to it. No crops, no winter, a man named Odell Cooper told her flat out, blocking her path on the road one morning, his horse standing sideways across it like an obstacle placed on purpose. Odell ran the biggest spread in the valley, 300 acres of winter wheat, and he had opinions he felt entitled to share with anyone nearby. You can't eat duck feathers. No, Maris said. You can't. Then what exactly is your plan, girl? She hated that word. Girl. She was 26, she was standing on her own land, and she owed this man nothing. But she also needed to get past his horse, and she didn't have the energy right now for a fight she wouldn't win in the middle of a public road. I'm working it out, she said, which was true. Odell looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man whose patience is performing labor it resents. Then he clicked at his horse and moved. She walked past without looking back. She got about 50 yards down the road before she let herself clench her jaw tight enough to hurt. There were days that summer when the loneliness of it all was worse than the heat. She'd wake up before light and lie still in her narrow bunk listening to the valley begin. Birds calling, somewhere a dog barking, the distant lowing of cattle, and feel the particular heaviness of a person who has made a bet nobody believes in. The kind of bet where you know you're right, but you're the only one who knows it, and the knowing isn't warm or comforting at all. It just sits in your chest like a stone. She had written 2 letters to her aunt in Missouri. The aunt had written back once, briefly, suggesting Maris might want to reconsider her situation and perhaps come east where there was family and reasonable prospects for a woman of her background. Maris had read the letter, folded it neatly, and put it in the cedar box with her mother's deed. She did not write back. The ducks came back. That was the thing that kept her going on the worst mornings. She would walk out just after dawn, when the air still had a thin coolness to it before the day burned it away, and they would be there. 2 mallards at first, then 4. By the middle of July, there were 7 birds using the pond regularly, a mix of mallards and what she was fairly sure were a pair of teal, quick and small and nervous, always first to lift off if she moved too fast. She began adjusting her movements. She approached from downwind. She kept her voice low. She stopped going all the way to the bank in the early mornings and instead observed from distance, kneeling in the dry grass with the sun behind her, watching the birds the way she might read a page of something complicated. She noticed things. Which birds were paired, where the females were spending time along the banks when they weren't on the water, the way the mallard hen kept returning to one particular stretch of bank on the south side, spending longer there than made sense just for feeding. Maris went and looked at that bank one afternoon when the birds had gone out to the fields. Pushed into the grass just above the waterline, half concealed by a clump of sedge that was one of the only green plants left on the property, was a shallow bowl of pressed grass and down feathers. Inside it, 6 pale green eggs. Maris crouched there so long her knees went stiff. She did not touch the eggs. She did not move anything. She stood up slowly, walked back the way she'd come, and when she reached her camp, she sat down on the lumber step of her little building and put her head in her hands. Not from sorrow, from something that had no clean name, relief and triumph, and a grief she hadn't expected, because this was the thing her mother had seen coming and Maris had found it alone. She stayed like that for a while. Then she got up and made coffee, because that's what you do, Tet. Margaret Holt came by the following Tuesday. This time, she was not with her husband. She rode out herself, side saddle on a brown mare, and stopped at the edge of the hollow, where the road ran along the upper rim. Maris was working at the far bank, reinforcing a section that had slumped slightly after 2 nights of wind. She saw Margaret up there and felt something cold move through her, separate from the morning air. She kept working. Margaret called down after a moment. My husband says you've been hauling water from Birch Creek for months. Maris kept her eyes on what her hands were doing. That's right. That's 1.5 miles each way. That's right. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Below her on the water, 3 ducks moved in slow circles. Maris did not look up. All that work, Margaret said finally, and there was something in her voice that was not quite contempt and not quite curiosity, something suspended between them. For a duck pond. Yes, Maris said. Another pause. The ducks paddled. A meadowlark called from somewhere up the hill. Maris turned a shovelful of clay and packed it into the bank with the back of the blade. People think you've lost your mind, Margaret said. Maris set the shovel down and looked up for the first time. Margaret Holt was backlit by the morning sky, her face hard to read in the glare. I know what people think, Maris said. They looked at each other for a moment across the distance of the hollow. There was something in Margaret's expression that Maris could not fully name, not the open laughter of that day on the street in Greer, but something still unfriendly, still watchful. The look of a woman who has not decided yet whether she is watching someone fail or succeed and is reserving her response for whichever it turns out to be. Margaret turned her horse and rode back toward the road without another word. Maris watched her go. Then she picked up her shovel and went back to work. By the end of that week, she had found 3 more nests. The birds were claiming the whole south bank now, working into the grasses that had come up near the waterline where the soil stayed damp. Maris walked that stretch every morning, moving quietly, memorizing where each nest was so she could work around them, keeping her tools and buckets well clear. She counted the eggs each time she passed. She kept a small leather-covered notebook, the kind a school teacher might carry, and recorded what she saw. Number of nests, number of eggs, which birds were laying and which were sitting. She felt almost embarrassed about the notebook sometimes, wondered what a passerby would think seeing her crouch in the grass with it, scribbling. But she kept doing it. The numbers were adding up. She was doing the math in her head on a Thursday morning when Dale Birch rode up to the property line. His wheat was looking poor. She could see it from here, the thin stalks yellow at the edges, the kind of crop that would fight you until the end of July and then stop trying. He looked at her pond. He looked at the birds on it. He counted them, she could tell, because his eyes moved the same methodical way hers did when she was taking stock of something. How many nests? He said. 4, Maris said. That I've found. He nodded slowly. He seemed to be working something out. You going to sell the eggs? Haven't decided yet, she said, which was not entirely true. She had decided. She just wasn't ready to say it yet out loud. Dale looked at his own ground for a moment, then back at hers. The difference was visible and painful, and neither of them mentioned it. Hot July coming, he said. Yes, Maris agreed. He rode home without another word. But he didn't laugh. That was the first time a neighbor had come to the hollow's edge and not laughed. She marked that in her notebook, too. The week before the worst of the summer heat arrived, Maris found the 7th nest. It was tucked into a hollow at the base of the limestone rise to the north, farther from the water than she'd expected any bird to claim territory, and the hen sitting on it, a mallard with a torn feather on her left wing, which was how Maris had been tracking her, didn't move when Maris approached, just watched her with one bright eye and sat completely still, which meant she was committed to those eggs the way only a creature with no other options could be. Maris understood that feeling in a way that went deeper than she could have explained to anyone. She crouched a few feet away and looked at the bird for a long time. The bird looked back. I'm not going to bother you, Maris said quietly. You stay where you are. She stood up and walked back to her camp. The sky in the west that evening had a strange yellowish cast, the kind that came before the worst weather, the kind that old-timers in the valley read like a warning. The creek had been dropping for weeks. She'd walked its length last Sunday and found 3 sections where it was barely running at all, just thin threads of water between pale stones that had been submerged only a month ago. The drought was coming. Not a dry spell. Not a hard July. A real drought, the kind that swallows years. Maris looked at her pond in the fading light. The water was clear now, the silt mostly settled after weeks of stillness. The ducks were settling in for the night, drawing into the reeds at the south bank, making small sounds. She had 40 acres of mostly useless land, a deep clay-lined pond holding more water than anything else in the valley, 7 nests, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 eggs protected under the care of birds who had chosen this place without being asked. She also had neighbors who thought she was foolish, a town that had laughed at her, no crops, no livestock, and less than $15 in the cedar box. She allowed herself exactly one moment of doubt, just stood there, letting it wash through her completely. Every fear, every voice that sounded like Margaret Holt, every night she'd lain awake in the dark, wondering if she was wrong. Then she let it go. She turned back to her camp, lit the lamp, and opened her notebook to a fresh page. The drought could come. She'd be ready. The drought did not arrive politely. It did not give warnings the way a reasonable disaster might, did not build slowly enough for people to prepare. It arrived the way the worst things always do, fast enough that by the time everyone understood what was happening, it was already too late to do much about it. One week the creek was running thin, but running. The next week it was not running at all. Just a pale scar of dry stones cutting through the valley floor, and the sky above it white and empty and merciless, day after day after day. Maris felt it first in the mud. She had spent enough time on her knees at the pond's edge to know its textures the way she knew her own hands. The outer margins, the damp fringe that always stayed a little soft. She noticed them firming up, not drying, not cracking, not yet. But the give was going out of them. The soil was pulling the moisture deeper, or losing it to the air, or both, and the process was slow enough you could tell yourself it wasn't happening if you wanted to. Maris did not want to tell herself that. She began hauling water again. Not from Birch Creek. Birch Creek was down to a series of standing pools separated by dry gravel bars, and she'd watched a pool like that before, knew how fast it could turn from water to mud to nothing once the shade left it. She went further. 2 miles up the north side of the valley to where a limestone shelf forced an underground seep up through the surface, a trickle so thin and reliable it probably hadn't stopped running since before any white settler had seen this country. She'd found it in May, marked it in her notebook, and filed the information away the way she filed everything, quietly, without telling anyone. The yoke across her shoulders had long since pressed permanent soreness into the muscle on both sides. Percy helped when she could get him to cooperate, which was not every morning. The mule had a particular talent for reading her mood and responding to desperation with stubbornness, and those early August mornings when the heat came up before sunrise and the air already felt used and thin, those were the mornings Percy chose to plant his feet and look at her with his long, suffering expression. "I know," she told him on one such morning, one hand on his nose, forehead nearly touching his. "I know. Me too." He went that day. She made 4 trips on the good days, 3 on the bad ones, and the pond held its level through the first 2 weeks of August, while everything else in the valley tightened and dried and drew inward. Dale Birch's wheat was gone by the second week. Not failed, gone. The kind of crop failure that doesn't leave you anything to salvage, doesn't give you a poor harvest you can stretch with careful rationing. His fields were standing straw by August 10th, the heads empty, the stalks snapping at a touch, and when the wind moved through them, they made a sound like paper burning. He stood at the edge of his north field for a long time that morning, and his oldest boy, 17, already nearly as tall as his father, stood next to him and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. Maris saw them from the road when she was coming back from the seep with her water buckets. She slowed down without meaning to. Dale's back was to her, his hat in his hand, and something about the angle of his shoulders, the way a person looks when they've taken a blow they were half expecting and it still hit harder than they thought it would, kept her from calling out. She walked past without speaking. She felt guilty about it for the rest of the day. Not because she could have said anything useful, but because silence in a moment like that is its own kind of statement, and she wasn't sure hers had been kind. That evening she went to her notebook and looked at the egg counts from the past 2 weeks. 43 eggs across 7 nests. The oldest clutch, the mallard hen with the torn feather, the one she thought of as torn, had been sitting for over 3 weeks now. The others were at various stages. She'd been counting carefully, cross-referencing the approximate laying dates with the rough incubation timeline she'd read about in a pamphlet she'd found in the bottom of a crate of books she'd bought at an estate sale in Greer the previous spring. She was going to have ducklings soon, possibly within a week. And she had 43 eggs in active nests that she had deliberately not touched, not disturbed, not moved. She'd been watching them the way you watch something that is not yet ready, the way you wait for bread to rise in the pan, with patience that costs you something, because there is always the urge to push, to take what's already there, to stop waiting. She closed the notebook. She had made her decision about the eggs weeks ago. She'd said as much to Dale Birch, haven't decided yet, which was true in the sense that she hadn't said it out loud to another person. But she'd known since the morning she found the first nest and felt that peculiar grief and triumph feeling sitting on the step of her little building. She was not going to sell them. She was barely going to keep any for herself. Odell Cooper's well went brackish on August 15th. He came into Greer that morning while Maris was picking up a sack of cornmeal from the supply store, and he did not look like a man who ran 300 acres and had opinions about other people's land management decisions. He looked pale under his tan, and there was a particular thinness around his eyes that Maris recognized from the years watching her mother calculate how far a dollar would stretch. He was scared. He didn't announce it. Men like Odell Cooper don't announce fear. They carry it sideways, like something they're pretending they're not holding. But she saw it. She'd been watching people long enough. He bought salt and hardtack in a 10-gallon barrel, and while Gus Greer was loading the barrel onto his wagon, Odell stood at the counter and drummed his fingers on the wood and stared at nothing. Maris paid for her cornmeal and picked it up. She almost walked past him. "Mr. Cooper," she said. He looked at her. For a moment something passed over his face. She thought it might be embarrassment, the particular kind that comes when you've been unkind to someone and now you need something from them. But it went under fast, replaced by the familiar squint. "Miss Rowan." "I heard the Cooper well is down," she said, which was a polite way of saying what they both knew. "It'll come back," he said. "Always does." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. They were standing in a supply store in a valley with no running water and a sky that hadn't produced a cloud in 19 days, and they were both pretending everything was going to be fine in the way people do when being honest feels more dangerous than lying. "My pond is holding," she said. He said nothing. "If the well doesn't come back," she said, "send one of your hands." She picked up her cornmeal and walked out. She didn't know why she'd said it. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment, the flour sack against her hip, and felt a little irritated at herself. Odell Cooper had stood in that same road and watched Margaret Holt laugh at her and done nothing. He'd called her girl on a public road and blocked her way with his horse. She did not owe him anything. But she'd said it anyway. Maybe because there were 7 children on the Cooper property, and she'd seen them at the church social in June, running through the grass, and that had nothing to do with their father and his horse. She walked to where Percy was tied and loaded the cornmeal into the saddlebag. The ducklings came on a Thursday. Maris almost missed it. She'd been at the north end of the property that morning, checking a low spot in the fence line where something had been pressing against the wire. Probably a deer, desperate enough to test any boundary between itself and water. She was tightening the wire when she heard a sound from the direction of the south bank. Not quacking. Something smaller and more continuous. A kind of calling that was not quite a peep, not quite a whistle, but something she'd never heard before and still recognized immediately. She dropped the wire and ran. She was not a person who ran. She was a person who moved with deliberation and purpose, who saved her energy because there was never enough of it. But she ran now, across the dry grass, around the north end of the pond, and came around the bend of the south bank out of breath and stopped. Torn was on the water, and around her, bumping against her sides and diving under and popping up and bumping against each other, were 8 ducklings, small as fists, dark and vivid, moving with an energy so complete and unself-conscious it looked almost like joy. Maris put her hand over her mouth. She stood there for a long time. The ducklings had no opinion about the drought. They had no opinion about brackish wells or failed wheat crops or the laughter of Margaret Holt. They had hatched into the worst summer the valley had seen in 20 years, and they were diving under the surface of a pond that should not have survived this long, and they were doing it with everything they had. Maris sat down in the grass at a distance that wouldn't disturb them and stayed until the shadows of the limestone rise came across the water. She was crying by then. She hadn't noticed when it started. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and felt slightly embarrassed, which was foolish since no one could see her. "Okay," she said out loud, to no one, to herself, to the ducklings on the water. "Okay." She stood up, brushed the dry grass off her skirt, and went back to tighten the fence wire. Dale Birch appeared at the edge of her property 2 days later, on a Saturday, in the early afternoon when the heat was its worst and no sensible person was moving around outside. He was on foot, which was unusual, and he was carrying nothing, which was more unusual still. Maris was at the pond, resealing a section of bank that had dried and cracked along the top edge. She looked up when she heard his boots on the path. He stopped about 10 feet from her. His hat was pulled down against the sun. His face was red and drawn. "I've got 7 kids," he said. No preamble. No good afternoon. "I know," Maris said. "The creek's been dry for 2 weeks. Well's going down." He paused. "We've still got some water in the barrel, but it's got a taste to it, and my youngest has been sick." Maris stood up straight. "How sick?" "Stomach. Isn't keeping things down." He looked at the pond, then at his boots, then back at the pond. "I don't know who else to ask." There it was. That sentence. I don't know who else to ask. And what it cost him was written all over his face. Dale Birch was not an unkind man, not really. He was a man who had watched her haul water all summer and ridden away without offering help. A man who had told his wife she'd gone peculiar and gone back to his own worrying. But he wasn't cruel. He was just a person who hadn't believed her, and now that was sitting heavy. "Come back tonight with your barrels," Maris said. "I'll have water ready." He looked at her. "I'll pay." "I don't want payment." "Maris." "Dale." She picked up her shovel. "Bring your barrels tonight." He stood there for another moment, something working through him that she didn't try to name. Then he nodded, put his hat back on, and walked back toward his land the way he'd come. Maris watched him go, then turned back to the cracked bank and kept working. By the end of the 3rd week of August, she had given water to 3 families. She tracked it in her notebook, not to hold it over anyone, not for leverage or reputation, just because she tracked everything in that notebook and water was more precious now than almost anything else on 40 acres of Wyoming territory. She gave the Birch family 2 barrels on Saturday and 1 more on the following Wednesday when Dale came back quietly, earlier in the morning, before the worst heat. She gave water to a widow named Clara Foss who lived 1.5 miles south and who showed up at the property line one morning with a mule and a single small barrel and stood there in the road not saying anything until Maris looked up from what she was doing. "I heard Dale Birch say you had water," Clara said. "Yes." "I don't have much to trade." "I'm not trading," Maris said. "Come to the pond." Clara was 60-something, with hands that had seen every kind of work a frontier woman's hands see. She filled her barrel slowly, carefully, without wasting a drop, and when she was done, she stood and looked at the pond for a long moment. Looked at the ducks on it. There were 11 now, counting the 8 ducklings who were growing fast and testing their wings in short, awkward hops along the bank. Looked at the green fringe of plants at the waterline, the only genuinely green thing visible in any direction. "Your mother would have liked to see this," Clara said. Maris looked at her. Clara was already turning to lead her mule back toward the road. Maris didn't ask how Clara had known her mother. She just stood there and felt the sentence settle into her like a stone into water. The 3rd family was the Coopers. Not Odell, not him personally. He sent 2 of his ranch hands, young men who came in the evening with a wagon and 4 barrels and did not meet Maris's eyes. One of them handed her a note, folded twice, with Odell's name at the bottom. "Miss Rowan, I am obliged." Cooper. She read it twice, then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. "Fill your barrels," she told the ranch hands, "and be careful near the south bank. There are nesting birds." One of the young men, the taller one, looked up at that. He looked at the ducks on the water, genuinely surprised, as if he'd expected to find some kind of infrastructure, pumps and pipes and engineering, and found birds instead. "Ducks did this?" he said. Maris looked at the pond, at the ducklings chasing each other along the far bank, at the water that was lower than she'd like, but still there, still present, still doing what water does in a living place. "Ducks chose this," she said. "I just made it worth choosing." The young man thought about that for a moment, then started filling the first barrel. Margaret Holt did not come in August. Maris noticed this the way you notice a gap in something, not looking for it, but aware of its shape once you see it. The Holts were further east, closer to the basin where the water table sat a little higher, and Maris had heard from Clara Foss that their well was still going, just slower. So Margaret did not need water yet. What Margaret did was talk. Maris heard this in pieces, through the particular way valley gossip traveled in drought years, with more speed than normal, because people had less to do and more to fear, and talk was what you did when the work ran out. She heard it from the Birch boy, who repeated it without thinking, and then caught himself and looked stricken. She heard it from Gus Greer at the supply store, who had the grace to look uncomfortable about being the one to tell her. What Margaret was saying was this, that Maris was letting the neighbors drink out of a muddy duck pond, that whatever she had out there wasn't water, it was runoff and filth and bird droppings, and the families drinking from it were going to regret it, that everyone had laughed at her hollow because it was genuinely laughable, and just because a drought had made things temporarily strange didn't mean the Rowan girl had been right about anything. Maris heard this and felt a cold, clean anger move through her that was different from the hurt of those early days on the road in Greer. This was not the anger of humiliation. It was the anger of a person watching someone cause harm and being unable to stop them, because Margaret's words were doing something. She'd spoken to Clara Foss's neighbor, a family named Whitmore, and the Whitmore wife had come to the pond once for water and then not come back, and Maris had heard through Dale Birch that Mrs. Whitmore was boiling creek mud instead, convinced the pond wasn't safe. Creek mud. Boiled or not, there was nothing left in the creek to boil. The Whitmore children were going to be sick on creek mud. Maris stood in her little building that evening, both hands on the table, staring at the wall, working through what to do about this. She was not good at confrontation. She was good at observation and labor and patience, and she was decent at quiet stubbornness, but direct conflict with another person, looking someone in the eye and telling them they were wrong and harmful, that was not natural to her. Her mother had been that way too. Chose work over argument, let results speak. But results took time, and the Whitmore children were thirsty now. She picked up her hat. Oh, the Holt property was 40 minutes by horse, which Maris didn't have, so she walked it in an hour and 15 minutes in the September heat with a handkerchief tied over the back of her neck, and her jaw set in the particular way it got when she was angry and concentrating. Margaret was hanging washing on a line in the side yard when Maris came through the gate. She saw Maris and went very still. To her credit, she didn't pretend. She didn't smile and pretend they were friendly neighbors having a nice visit. She just stood there with a sheet in her hands and watched Maris come across the yard. "I need to talk to you," Maris said. "I figured that," Margaret said. She didn't move, didn't put the sheet down. "I heard you've been giving water to half the valley. The Whitmores aren't coming to the pond because of what you said about it." Something shifted in Margaret's face. "I said what's true. Ducks make filth." "Water stays clean when there's enough of it and it's moving," Maris said. She was keeping her voice even, which cost her more than it should have. "The pond is deep, the birds don't crowd it, and the water is safer than creek mud by a mile. You're scaring people away from the only clean water they have access to. You don't know that it's clean. I've been drinking it for 2 months. That landed. Margaret's eyes moved to her, assessing, looking for signs of illness, finding none. Her grip on the sheet tightened slightly. "The Whitmore children are 3 and 5 years old," Maris said. "They need water, not boiled creek mud, actual water." "You can't just," Margaret started, then stopped herself. "What?" Maris said. "I can't what?" Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and something in her face, Maris would think about this later, more than once, trying to understand it. Something in there was not entirely hard. There was something beneath the stubbornness that looked almost like fear. Not fear of Maris, something older and less specific than that. "Your well is going to run dry eventually, too," Maris said, and she kept her voice level when she said it, not as a threat, but as a fact, because that's what it was. "When it does, I'll still give you water, the same as everyone else. That's not going to change no matter what." She turned and walked back out through the gate. She did not look back. Her heart was hammering in a way she found annoying. She had not said everything she wanted to say. She'd wanted to say more, wanted to say what it had felt like to stand on that road with that deed while Margaret threw her head back and let that laugh rip across the street. She hadn't said it because it wouldn't have helped anyone. She walked home in the September heat and got back to the pond just as the sun was going down and the ducks were settling in for the night, and she sat at the edge of the bank for a long time saying nothing. The Whitmore family came the next morning. Maris was refilling her own water buckets at the near end of the pond when she heard the wagon on the road. She looked up and saw the Whitmore husband, a thin, quiet man named Ernest, pulling the wagon to a stop at the property line, 2 barrels in the back, his wife beside him on the seat holding a baby that Maris hadn't known about. 3 children, then, not 2. Ernest climbed down from the wagon and took off his hat. "We heard you had water," he said. "Come on then," Maris said. She pointed at the south bank. "Stay clear of the far end. There are nests along there." Ernest nodded and clicked at the horse. His wife looked at Maris as the wagon rolled past. A quick look, complicated. Gratitude and something that might have been shame and something that might have been relief, all moving through in a second before she looked back down at the baby in her arms. Maris went back to her buckets. She heard the sound of water filling the first barrel, and the sound of Ernest's older children climbing out of the back of the wagon and asking questions he answered in a low voice, and the sound of the ducks on the water making their small, continuous sounds. And she stayed where she was and let it all be what it was. She was tired. Her shoulders ached. The pond was lower than she wanted it, and she was going to have to make 2 more trips to the limestone seep this week to keep ahead of the loss. The notebook had 47 eggs recorded across 8 nests now, and a second clutch from Torn had started in the original nest at the base of the sedge clump, which meant the season was extending in a way she hadn't counted on. There was more work than there had ever been. She was also not sick. She was lean and dark from the sun, and her hands were permanently stained, and her one good dress had become her work dress by accident, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd cared about that. But she was not sick. She was not hungry. She was not watching everything she'd built crumble into dry clay. That was more than most people in the valley could say right now. She hauled her full buckets back to the storage barrels she'd set up under the shade of her building and went to start the first trip to the seep. September brought a wind from the north that was cooler but not wet, the kind of wind that dries out your lips and eyes and makes you aware of how much moisture is always leaving your body without permission. The valley got quiet in a way that had passed beyond worry into something more resigned, a collective holding of breath that had been going on so long people had almost forgotten they were holding it. Maris made 7 trips to the limestone seep in the first 2 weeks of September. She'd rigged a system with Percy involving a wider sling across the mule's back that let her carry 6 gallons instead of 4, which meant Percy's cooperation was even more essential, and he knew it. He extracted payment in the form of rest breaks, which she allowed, and the last of a sack of oats she'd been rationing, which she also allowed because she didn't have much choice. The pond held at a level she could work with. Not full. It hadn't been full since July. But stable. The birds seemed to understand something about economy of motion in the heat that the humans around them were still learning. They moved less in the worst parts of the day, found shade, ate what the water brought to them rather than swimming miles to look for more. Maris watched them and did the same. She ate less, moved slower in the afternoons, saved her energy for morning and evening. She slept deeply and woke before light. She had stopped going to Greer more than once a week because each trip was energy and time and Percy's oats, and she could feel herself rationing in the deep, constant way her mother had rationed during the worst years. Not from panic, but from a clear-eyed arithmetic that ran underneath everything, always. The notebook was filling up. On a Thursday in mid-September, when she was sitting at the pond's edge in the early evening recording the day's egg count, Dale Birch rode up to the property line. He did this sometimes now, not to ask for anything, just to stand at the edge and look, the way a person stands at a window and looks out at something. Like the pond had become a reference point for him. Something he needed to verify was still there. 47 eggs, she said, without looking up, plus the second Torn clutch, which I'm counting separately. A pause. Who's Torn? The mallard with the damaged wing feather. I've been tracking her separately since the first nest. Another pause. You named the ducks. She looked up then. I named one duck, for tracking purposes. Dale's face was doing something complicated that resolved after a moment into what she was fairly sure was the first smile she'd ever seen on him. My youngest is better, he said. The stomach thing. Good. She's been asking about the ducks. He glanced toward the south bank where Torn's ducklings were running along the margin in their now familiar line. I told her they were doing fine. Maris looked at the ducklings. They were bigger now, their down giving way at the edges to the first real feathers, which made them look scruffy and unfinished in the way that young things often do just before something clicks into place. They are, she said. He sat on his horse for a moment longer, then nodded at her and turned for home. She watched him ride out along the property line, and she thought about names. The way naming something changes how you see it, makes it real in a different way, makes it matter in a way that things without names sometimes don't. She'd named one duck, for tracking purposes. That was what she'd said. She looked back at the notebook. The pond had 47 eggs in active nests, 8 growing ducklings, and she counted the birds on the water in the last of the evening light. 14 adults now, which meant new birds had been arriving, choosing this place the way the first 2 mallards had chosen it, finding it by whatever sense ducks use to find water in a dry country. The hollow that everyone had said was worthless was becoming the only living thing for miles. She wrote the count in the notebook and closed it. The north wind moved through the dry grass around the pond, and the birds settled, and the sky over the limestone rise went from orange to a deep burnished rose that she didn't take time to appreciate because she needed to get back and eat something before the light went entirely. But she paused anyway, just for a moment. The valley stretched out below the hollow in the fading light, brown and quiet and holding on. All those families holding on inside their dried-out properties, and above it all the sky doing what it always did with total indifference, beautiful and enormous and unconcerned. She had not fixed the drought. She had not saved anyone. She had dug a hole in the ground and hauled water to it until the water stayed, and the birds had done the rest. And now she was sharing what she had with people who had laughed at her, and people who had scared others away from her water, and people like Clara Foss who said quiet, true things, and a man like Dale Birch who came to the property line sometimes just to look. She hadn't fixed anything. She was just in the middle of it, the same as everyone else. She turned back toward her building, where the lamp was already lit, and the evening was coming on fast, and there was a pot of beans that had been going since morning and probably needed another look. She'd figure out the rest tomorrow. The beans ran out on a Tuesday. Not just her beans, though hers did run out, down to the last scraping in the pot that she stretched across 2 days by adding creek sedge and dried grass seed that technically you could eat if you cooked it long enough, though she would not recommend it to anyone who had options. When she said the beans ran out, she meant the valley's beans, the stored grain, the smoked meat, the root cellars that families had been rationing since July with increasing desperation and decreasing success. September had moved into October, and the sky still had not broken. 23 days since any measurable rain, then 28. Then the number stopped meaning much because at some point you stop counting and just deal with what is in front of you, which in most of the valley's case was very little. The Cooper spread, 300 acres, the biggest operation in Callaway County, had sold off 2/3 of its cattle in September when the feed ran out, driving them east toward the rail town in a cloud of dust that took 2 days to settle. Maris had watched that drive from the north ridge of her property, the line of cattle stretching down the valley road in the early morning light, and she'd done the arithmetic without wanting to. Odell Cooper was a proud man with a big operation, and he was selling his herd in drought to stay solvent, which meant things were worse than she'd estimated. The Whitmore baby had a name, Lucy, and she'd been sick again, and again it had been the water, this time from a barrel that hadn't been cleaned properly before refilling. Ernest Whitmore had come to the pond with hat in hand for the 3rd time, and explained this while looking somewhere to the left of Maris's shoulder, and she'd told him to bring all his barrels, and she'd help him clean them, which they'd done on a Sunday afternoon in the thin October sun. Lucy was better by Wednesday. Ernest brought a jar of preserved plums and left it on the step of her building without saying anything, and Maris found it that evening and stood there looking at it for a moment longer than made sense. She ate 3 of them that night, saved the rest. The egg situation was the thing that was changing everything, though not in the way she'd expected it to. She'd expected the nesting to slow with the season. That was natural. The birds should have been preparing to move, heading south ahead of the cold, and the laying should have tapered off as the days shortened. What she had not expected was for the pond to become, in the absence of every other water source in the valley, a staging ground, a convergence point. Birds coming from both north and south, breaking their migration at this unexpected surviving water, resting, feeding, and in some cases deciding to stay a little longer than birds should have been staying. She woke up one morning in the first week of October and counted 31 birds on the pond. She stood at the edge of her building in the gray early light, counting 3 times to make sure, and the number kept coming back 31. She went to the notebook and wrote it down, then sat for a while. 31 birds. Torn's second clutch had hatched, 7 more ducklings, currently in that awkward in-between phase of being mostly feathered but not quite confident about it. The original 8 were nearly indistinguishable from the adults now, except for a certain quality of attention they had, a newness to the world that showed up in how they moved. And the new arrivals, mostly mallards but also a pair of pintails, and what she was fairly certain was a ring-necked duck she'd never seen this far west before, were using the South Bank the way the early birds had, working the waterline, leaving tracks in the soft margin that she read each morning like a letter delivered overnight. There were eggs she could take now. That was the thing. The season was shifting, the new arrivals wouldn't nest this late, and the season's ducklings were grown enough that the original nesting hens could afford to lose some of the later eggs without catastrophic consequence to the population. She'd been careful all summer, had not taken a single egg, had protected every nest with a ferocity that would have seemed excessive to anyone watching who didn't understand what she was building toward. Now she could take. Carefully. Precisely. The way you harvest without depleting. The thing that farmers who thought only about this season kept failing to grasp. She did the math for the third time that week. She was good at the math. She'd been doing it her whole life, learned it at her mother's knee, where the arithmetic was always about survival and never about abundance. She started gathering eggs on a Thursday morning. Not all of them. Not the ones still being actively sat on by birds she recognized as committed nesters. She'd mapped the pond so thoroughly by now that she knew each nest's status the way a postmaster knows the status of each letter in a sorting room. She took only from nests that had been abandoned, only the surplus from hens who had more than they could realistically hatch at this point in the season. She moved quietly, touched nothing unnecessarily, and when she was done, she had 14 eggs in the flat-bottom basket she'd built from strips of willow in August. 14 eggs. She stood in the middle of the property, looking at the basket in her hands, and thought about how to do this. She went to Clara Foss first, not because Clara had the greatest need, though her need was real, but because Clara was the kind of person you could think out loud with, the kind who listened without inserting herself into the silence. Maris had discovered this over the course of the summer. On the mornings Clara came for water, and sometimes stayed a while at the pond's edge, saying very little but staying, which was its own kind of company. Clara was at her kitchen table when Maris arrived, mending a shirt that had been mended so many times it was mostly patches touching each other. She looked at the basket and said nothing. "I can bring eggs when I have surplus," Maris said. "Not every week, but regular enough to count on. I need you to help me figure out who needs them most." Clara set the mending down. She thought about it with the deliberateness of someone who has been around long enough to know that help offered badly can wound as much as help withheld. "The Fenton family," she said finally. "Harlow Fenton's been laid up since August with his back, can't work, and his wife is expecting in November. They're down to almost nothing." Maris nodded. "Who else?" "Sid Pulver's alone and too stubborn to say anything. He's eating whatever the garden gave him before it died, which wasn't much." She paused. "The Birch children are fine. Dale's been managing. The Coopers have money even if their well's bad. The Whitmores you already know about." She looked at Maris. "How many eggs can you spare?" "Right now, 14. More later if the birds keep cooperating." Clara looked at the basket again. "Harlow Fenton first," she said. "Then Sid. Then the Whitmore baby needs eggs more than the parents would admit." "All right," Maris said. "You're going to get pushback," Clara said. It was not a warning, just a statement, the way she made most statements. "Some people don't take help easy." "I know. And some people will take help and talk badly about you anyway, because taking help makes them feel small, and they'll want to put that feeling somewhere." Maris looked at her. "I know that too." Clara picked up her mending. "Good. Leave me 2 eggs and take the rest where they're needed." Harlow Fenton was a big man who had been made small by pain. He was lying on a rope bed in the back room of a low sod house when Maris arrived, his wife Nell showing her in with the particular exhausted efficiency of a woman who has been managing everything for weeks and is running low on what she's managing it with. The room smelled like liniment and unwashed blankets. Harlow looked at Maris from the bed with the wariness of a man not accustomed to being seen in a helpless position. "Miss Rowan," he said. "Mr. Fenton." A pause. "We don't need charity." Nell made a sound in the doorway that was not quite a word. "It's not charity," Maris said. She set the basket on the small table beside the bed. "I have more eggs than I can use, and they won't keep in this heat. You'd be doing me a favor taking them." That was not entirely true, and they both knew it. But it was the shape of the truth that allowed him to take the eggs without the thing inside him that resisted help breaking open into something worse. And Maris had learned from watching her mother that how you offer matters as much as what you offer. Harlow looked at the eggs for a moment. He was a proud man. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he was working something through. "Back's bad," he said finally. "I heard. Should have been better by now." He said it quietly, almost to himself. "Sometimes these things take longer than they should," Maris said. Nell had come forward and was lifting the cloth over the basket, counting quietly. 6 eggs. Her face did something Maris looked away from, because some expressions are private even when they happen in front of you. "Thank you," Nell said. The words were simple and worn smooth, and she meant them the way words mean things when nothing else is left. Maris nodded and picked up the empty basket. She was at the door when Harlow called after her. "Miss Rowan." She turned. He was looking at the ceiling, not at her. "People said you were a fool to buy that hollow." "Yes," she said. "They did." He was quiet for a moment. "They were wrong," he said. Maris looked at him for just a second longer. "Rest well, Mr. Fenton," she said, and walked back out into the October sun. Well, Sid Pulver was harder. Sid was 68, lived alone, and had the self-sufficient ferocity of a man who had survived everything the territory had thrown at him for 30 years by refusing to need anything from anybody. His barn had burned 3 winters back, and he'd rebuilt it himself, alone, through a Wyoming January, and he'd never asked for so much as a nail from a neighbor. When Maris knocked on his door, he opened it and looked at her basket and said, "No." "Sid, I said no." He started to close the door. "Your garden's gone," Maris said. The door stopped. He hadn't closed it, which was something. "Everybody's garden is gone," he said. "Yes, but most people have family, or a neighbor they'll accept help from, or savings toward buying something in town." She paused. "You have none of those things because you've spent 30 years making sure you didn't need them, and now you need them." The door opened a little wider. He looked at her with an expression that was more complicated than anger. It had anger in it, and beneath that something very tired, and beneath that something she recognized. Fear was in there. The particular fear of a person who has been alone so long that accepting help feels like the first step toward a kind of disappearing. "I'm not asking you to need me," Maris said. "I'm asking you to take 4 eggs and eat them and be alive next spring when this drought breaks." He stared at her. "It will break," she said. "They always do." A long silence. A crow called from somewhere behind the sod house. The wind moved through the dead grass in the yard. 4, he said. 4, Maris agreed. She held out the basket. He reached in and took 4 eggs with the deliberate care of a man handling something he was trying not to want, and closed his fingers around them. "Come back," he said. "When I have surplus." He nodded once, jaw working. "All right then." He closed the door. Maris stood on his step for a moment. She could hear him inside, moving, the sound of a pan being pulled from somewhere. She turned and walked back toward the road. She was halfway home when she heard hoofbeats coming fast from the east road, and something about the sound, too fast, too purposeful for ordinary travel, made her step to the side of the road and wait. It was one of the Cooper Ranch hands, the tall one who'd asked about the ducks. He pulled his horse up hard when he saw her, and the horse did a small, anxious circle before settling. "Miss Rowan," he was breathing hard. "Mr. Cooper wants to know if you can come to his place." She looked at him. "Why?" The young man looked uncomfortable in the particular way of someone delivering a message they're not sure they've been sent on with good faith. "He didn't say exactly, just, he asked for you personally, said it was important." Maris considered this for a moment. Odell Cooper had sent her a 3-word note and 2 ranch hands for water, and now he was sending a rider to ask for her personally. The last time she'd spoken to him directly, he'd called her girl on a public road. "Tell him I'll come tomorrow morning," she said. The ranch hand looked like he'd been hoping for a faster answer. He said it was urgent. "I have work to do before dark," Maris said. "Tomorrow morning." He nodded reluctantly and turned his horse back east. Maris watched him go, then kept walking. She spent the rest of that afternoon at the pond, doing what needed doing. Water levels, nest checks, the fence section that needed attention again. She cooked her dinner and ate it at the step and wrote up the day in her notebook and went to bed. She lay awake for a while, thinking about Odell Cooper and what urgent might mean when it came from a man like him. It probably meant something that felt urgent to him, which might or might not be the same as something that actually was. She fell asleep with the wind picking up outside, rattling the loose board on the north wall that she kept meaning to fix. She arrived at the Cooper property at 8 in the morning, which was earlier than she'd said and later than he'd wanted, and she figured that landed approximately where she intended. The Cooper operation looked different than it had in June, the last time she'd been on this road. The corrals were mostly empty. She could count the remaining cattle through the fence, maybe 40 head, where there had been hundreds. The big barn had a temporary-looking patch on the east wall. 2 of the outbuildings were closed up, tools put away, the kind of tidying that happens when there are fewer hands to use them. Odell met her in the yard. He was wearing his work clothes, not his good ones, and he looked like a man who had not been sleeping enough. He took off his hat when she rode up. She'd borrowed Percy, who maintained his opinion about long trips but had gone, and held it in front of him. "Miss Rowan," he said, "I appreciate you coming." "Mr. Cooper." She dismounted and tied Percy to the fence. "What's the trouble?" He turned toward the house, expecting her to follow, which she did, through the front door and into the main room where Margaret was sitting at the table. Maris had not known Margaret would be here. She felt a small recalibration happen in her chest and let it settle before she looked at the woman directly. Margaret was not herself. That was the first thing Maris registered, and it was distinct enough that the other feelings, the memory of that laugh on the road in Greer, the words Margaret had spread through the valley about dirty duck water, went briefly quiet underneath the simply human recognition that something was wrong. Margaret's eyes were red at the margins. Her hands, which were usually moving, were folded still on the table in front of her. "Margaret's been sick," Odell said. He said it carefully, in the way of a man choosing words around a wound. "Since last week. We thought it was the usual autumn illness. But it's been a week and she's not improving." Maris looked at Margaret. "What kind of sick?" "Stomach, mostly." Margaret's voice was flat, drained of its usual certainty. "I can't keep much down. The headache started 4 days ago." "What have you been drinking?" A silence. Odell looked at the floor. "The well," Margaret said. Maris looked at her steadily. "How long has the well tasted off?" Another silence, longer. "Since August," Odell said. "We kept thinking it would clear, added extra lime in September." He put his hat back on his head and then took it off again. "I kept telling her it was fine." "It wasn't fine," Maris said. She said it without judgment, just as a fact, because that's what it was. Margaret looked at the table. A muscle in her jaw moved. "She needs clean water," Maris said. "A lot of it, for several days, while whatever's in her system clears. And she needs to keep eating, even if it's hard. Small amounts." "That's what I thought," Odell said. "And I was going to ask if you'd be willing to—" "I'll bring water," Maris said. "Tomorrow morning, enough for a week. Clean barrels only. I'll check them myself before I fill them." Odell nodded. He looked like he was going to say something more and then thought better of it. Maris looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at her hands. "Margaret," Maris said. The woman looked up. "I need you to stop drinking the well water completely, starting now. Not a cup. Nothing." Margaret looked at her for a moment. "All right," she said quietly. That was all. No argument, no edge to it. She just said all right, the way someone says it when they're too tired to be anything but honest. Maris nodded. She looked at Odell. "I'll be here by 7 tomorrow." She went back out and untied Percy and rode home. She didn't let herself think about it too hard on the way back. She'd done what needed doing, and she'd do it again tomorrow and the day after, and that was the shape of it. The feelings about Margaret, the complicated tangle of old hurt, and the strange thing that had happened sitting at that table just now, she'd get to that eventually. Right now there was too much else. The pond was waiting. The birds needed checking. She had 4 more families she'd been thinking about for the egg distribution, and she hadn't gotten to all of them yet. She got back to the hollow in early afternoon and tied Percy and went straight to the water. 3 days after her visit to the Cooper place, something shifted in the valley that had nothing to do with the weather. It started, she thought later, with Dale Birch. He'd come by on a Monday morning, as he sometimes did now, and instead of standing at the property line, he'd come all the way to the pond's edge and stood there watching the birds for a while. "I want to show you something," he said. She followed him to the south boundary of his property, where a natural depression in the land had collected clay beneath a thin layer of topsoil. She'd walked past it a dozen times and not stopped, but now Dale was standing at its edge with the look of a man who had been thinking. "My grandfather used to call this a slough," Dale said. "Said you couldn't farm it, said it was nothing." Maris crouched and pressed her palm against the clay bottom. It was dry now, cracked in that fine web pattern she knew well. But underneath, she pressed harder. There was give. "It's deeper than it looks," she said. "About 4 feet, I think, when I poked it with a stake." He paused. "You think it could hold water?" She stood up and looked at him. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has been watching someone do something for months without understanding it, and now thought he might understand it, and was asking someone to tell him if he was wrong. "The clay's good," she said. "You'd need to pack the bottom and cut the banks back at an angle. Haul water to start it, or wait for rain. But it would hold." He nodded slowly. "How long did it take you?" "To dig out?" 3 weeks, more or less. Packing the clay was the worst part." She looked at the depression. "You could get it done faster with more hands." "I've got boys," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. "I can show you how I did mine," she said, "if you want." "I want," he said, with a directness that surprised her a little, as if the answer had been sitting there waiting, and he'd just been waiting to be asked the question. They spent 2 hours that afternoon walking the depression together, Maris explaining what she'd done and why, Dale asking questions that were better than she'd expected, practical, specific, not the questions of a man looking for a shortcut, but of one who actually wanted to understand the thing. His oldest boy came out partway through and listened from a distance, pretending to fix a fence post nearby, and by the end of it he'd drifted close enough to be part of the conversation. She walked back to the hollow that evening with something lighter in her chest that she didn't immediately identify. It wasn't until she was at the pond watching the birds settle in that she realized what it was. She had spent 4 months being the person everyone came to for something: water, eggs, information, help they were embarrassed to ask for. She had been the repository of a thing the valley needed, and she had given it freely, and that was right. She believed that. She didn't regret it. But there was a difference between giving people what you have and teaching someone to build the thing themselves. And that difference was the distance between relief and change. Dale Birch was going to dig his slough. His boys were going to help him. And if it worked, and she thought it would work, the clay was right, the depression was right, then next dry year, one more family in this valley would have water they built themselves. That was different. That was something that lasted. She wrote it in the notebook that night, though it wasn't an egg count or a water level, just DB. Slough on south property, clay good, depth sufficient. Showed him the bank angles. He's going to dig. And then she put the notebook away and went to sleep. The sky broke on October 19th, not gently. This was not the kind of rain that comes in politely, that you hear building from a distance, that gives you time to bring things in from outside. This was the kind that arrives in the night, that you wake to already in progress, already loud on the roof, already running in sheets off the eaves. Maris sat up in the dark and listened. She didn't move for a long time, just sat there in the narrow bunk with the rain hitting the roof like something thrown, and let herself hear it. Let the sound of it do what it needed to do, which was move through her in a way that had nothing to do with being practical or prepared or any of the things she'd been for 5 months. She cried. Not the way she'd cried at the ducklings. That had been private and specific, grief at the edge of a miracle. This was different. This was the cry of a person who has held their breath for so long they'd forgotten they were holding it, and finally, let it out. She allowed herself about 3 minutes of it. Then she got up, put on her boots and her coat, and went out into the rain to check the pond. The hollow was already running with water, thin sheets of it moving down the hillsides, finding the low channels, gathering toward the basin. The pond's level was rising. She could hear it rather than see it, the sound of the water changing the way a sound changes when a room is filling. The birds were agitated, calling in the dark, but they were there, they were on the water, they were fine. She stood in the rain getting soaked and looked up at the sky, which was dark and enormous and pouring itself out over the valley, and for once the enormous indifference of it felt like something other than a problem. She was soaked through by the time she went back inside. She pulled off her boots and her coat and sat on the edge of the bunk for a moment, dripping, Then she went to the notebook and wrote, "Rain, real rain, 10:19. She underlined it twice. Oh. By morning, the hollow had 3 inches of new water in the pond. By the following afternoon, 4 more. The limestone seep to the north was running stronger than she'd ever seen it, a thin, bright thread of water moving down through the rocks with a new confidence, feeding the basin from the north end while the rain fed it from above. On the morning of the 21st, Maris went to the south bank and stood looking at the water for a long time. The birds had increased overnight. She counted 42, then stopped counting. Migrants coming through in the rain, finding the pond the way migrants always found it now. Some information about this place having worked its way into whatever system birds use to know where safety is. She was trying to work out if she was happy, which was a strange thing to have to think about, but was true. She felt not happy, exactly. Something that sat alongside happy, something more like recognition. The feeling of looking at a thing and seeing that it is what you thought it was, that the work was the right work, that the strange and lonely arithmetic of 4 months of doubt and labor had come to the answer she'd suspected. It wasn't triumph. She was too tired for triumph, but it was something. She was standing there when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to see Margaret Holt. Not on her side saddle mare. On a wagon, a small one, with Odell driving and Margaret sitting beside him. She was bundled in a coat, still pale, still thin from the illness, but sitting upright. And when Odell pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of the hollow, she was the one who climbed down first. She came across the wet grass to where Maris was standing. She did not look entirely comfortable doing it, and she did not look entirely like herself, and she stopped about 4 feet away and held her coat closed against the wind. She looked at the pond for a moment, the birds on it, the rain still coming down in a thin, steady curtain. Then she looked at Maris. "I was wrong," Margaret said. Just that. 3 words, said quietly, without preamble or softening. Said the way hard things are said when a person has decided the only way through is direct. Maris looked at her. "About the water," Margaret said. "About what I said in town." She paused. "About a lot of things." The wind moved through the grass between them. On the pond, a duck called once, and then was quiet. Maris had thought about this moment. Not planned for it, not expected it exactly, but in the back of her mind, in the dark of her bunk on the nights when the drought was at its worst, and she was tired enough to let the bitterness out for a walk. She had thought about what she would feel when and if Margaret Holt ever said anything close to this. She'd thought she'd feel vindicated. She'd thought it might feel like that road in Greer, reversed. Like being the one who got to laugh now, or at least got to be silently right while the other person was silently wrong. It didn't feel like that. It felt like standing in the rain next to a person who was cold and had been sick and had come out here to say something that cost her something, and that was all it felt like. "I know," Maris said. Margaret nodded. A small motion. She looked back at the pond. "It's more than I thought it would be," she said. Meaning the water, meaning the birds, meaning whatever she'd been imagining when she'd called it a mud hole. "It took a while," Maris said. "I suppose it did." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "The Fenton girl told half the valley you brought eggs to her father when he was laid up. Said you wouldn't take payment. She shouldn't have said anything. She's 12. 12-year-olds say things." Margaret almost smiled, though it didn't fully arrive. "People are talking about you differently now." Maris said nothing. "I wanted you to know I'm aware of that," Margaret said. "And I know what I did in the spring, the things I said in town. I know that didn't help." She stopped. "I'm not good at this." "You're doing fine," Maris said. Something in Margaret's face shifted at that. Surprised, maybe, or relieved, or both. She'd been bracing for something, and the something hadn't come. Odell called from the wagon, asking if they needed anything from the barrels, and Margaret called back no, they'd brought plenty, and the ordinariness of the exchange, the domestic, practical, married people shorthand of it, landed in the moment and made both women feel slightly less like they were standing on a stage. "You'll come to the Valley meeting?" Margaret said. She was composing herself now, back toward her usual certainty, but it was a different kind of certainty than before, softer at the edges. "Next week." Dale Birch called one, "About the water situation. People want to hear what you know." Maris had not heard about any meeting. "I'll come," she said. Margaret nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something more and wasn't sure if she should. Then she turned and went back to the wagon, and Odell clicked at the horse, and the wagon turned in the road and went east. Maris watched it until it disappeared around the limestone rise. Then she turned back to the pond and stood there in the rain for a long time, the water coming down around her, the birds moving on the surface in their unhurried way, the hollow full of the sound of water doing what water does when the land is finally ready to hold it. She was tired in every part of herself. Her shoulders, her hands, the place behind her eyes that had been running calculations since May. She needed a real meal and a full night's sleep, and probably several days of neither hauling nor digging nor counting eggs. But the pond was full, and the birds were home, and somewhere to the south, Dale Birch's boys were probably out in the rain already, arguing about the best way to pack clay, getting their boots stuck. She allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite happiness, but was close enough to borrow the feeling from. Then she pulled her coat tighter and went to check the south bank nests, because rain this hard could shift the bank margins, and she needed to be sure the nesting hollows were still intact before anything else. The work was not done. She knew that. The rain had come and the drought had broken and the worst was behind them. But the work, the real work, the kind that outlasts a single crisis and becomes the thing a place is built on, that was just beginning. She checked every nest. All of them were holding. The valley meeting was held in the Greer feed barn on the last Thursday of October, and it was the most people Maris had seen gathered in one place since the church social in June, which felt like it had happened in a different life entirely. Dale Birch had called it. He'd ridden to every property in the valley over 3 days, which in the aftermath of the rain and the drought was no small thing. Roads still cut up, the creek running again but unpredictably, bridges soft at the footings. He'd done it anyway, and the fact that he'd done it personally, not sent word through a neighbor or posted a notice at Greer's store, said something about how seriously he was taking what he wanted to say. Maris arrived a few minutes before 7 in the evening with Percy tied outside and her good boots on, which were still her work boots but cleaned of most of the summer's accumulation. She was carrying her notebook. She almost left it behind, then decided that was foolish. The notebook had the numbers, and the numbers were the point. The barn was lit with 4 lanterns hanging from the beam, which was more light than most of these families had in their own homes. Someone had put out benches, mismatched things dragged from various buildings, and the families of Callaway County were arranged on them with the careful social geometry of people who had complicated recent histories with each other and were choosing their seating accordingly. She saw the pattern immediately. Dale Birch and his family near the center, his oldest boy sitting with the particular straightness of a young man trying to take up less space. The Whitmores on the left side, Ernest with Lucy on his knee, the baby smaller than Maris remembered. Harlow Fenton, sitting upright with visible effort, Nell beside him with one hand on his arm. Clara Foss in the back row, alone, which was apparently where she preferred to be. Sid Pulver standing at the wall near the door, because Sid Pulver did not sit in rooms full of people for long. And the Coopers in the front, which was where the Coopers always sat at community gatherings, the arrangement of a family accustomed to occupying the front of things. Odell with his hat on his knee. Margaret beside him, her color better than it had been at the pond, but still not what it had been in June. There were others Maris knew less well. Families from the eastern end of the valley, the Macaulay brothers who ran sheep on the North Ridge, a homesteader named Pratt, who'd arrived in April and was still working out what he'd gotten himself into. 23 people in total, which for Callaway County was nearly everyone. She found a seat on the end of a bench near the middle and set her notebook on her knee. Dale stood up when the lantern light was full and the noise settled, and he did not preamble or make a speech about the drought or the rain or the hardship they'd all been through together, because Dale Birch was not a speech-making man. He said, "I asked you all to come because I think this valley nearly didn't make it through the summer, and I think we need to talk about what to do so it doesn't happen again." Silence. The kind of silence that is not empty but full of the weight of the last 5 months, of dried creek beds and sick children and sold cattle and hard conversations had and not had. Then Odell Cooper said, from the front row, "Go on." Dale talked for about 10 minutes. He said what he'd seen, his wheat failing, the well dropping, the creek going dry. And he said it plainly, without self-pity, the way a man describes something that happened to him that wasn't his fault, but also wasn't someone else's problem. Then he said what he'd learned, which was harder for him, and you could hear it. I watched Maris Rowan haul water to a clay pond all summer, he said, and I thought she'd gone wrong somewhere. I told my wife she'd gone peculiar. A pause. I was wrong. What she did is the reason my youngest daughter drank clean water this summer, and I think some of you can say something similar. He looked at Maris then. She had not expected this and felt the lantern heat on her face suddenly more than before. I asked her to come tonight, Dale said, because she knows things about water on this land that none of us do. And I thought, before the next drought comes, which it will, because this is Wyoming and they always come, it might be worth listening. He sat down. 23 people looked at Maris. She had not prepared a speech. She had not expected to need to speak at all, had thought this was Dale's meeting, and she was there to answer questions if they came to her. She sat for a moment with the notebook on her knee, looking at the room, doing the quick internal calculation of what could usefully be said, and what would land badly, and what the room actually needed to hear. She stood up. I didn't do anything remarkable, she said. I dug a hole in the ground and kept water in it. The ducks did the rest. A few people shifted. Old Macaulay, the sheep man, made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been skepticism. What I did that was different, she said, was look at the land before I decided what it was good for. I bought the hollow because everyone said it was worthless, and I bought it cheap because of that. And what everyone had missed was that the clay underneath it was almost waterproof. It just needed to be managed. She opened the notebook. She didn't read from it. She didn't need to. She knew what was in it. But she held it the way you hold a thing that proves you're not making something up. The hollow went from a muddy 6-inch basin in May to a 4-foot pond that held water through the worst drought in 20 years, she said. Not because of luck, because clay packed right holds water. Deep water survives heat that shallow water doesn't. And still water, maintained water, draws birds, and birds lay eggs, and eggs fed 8 families in this valley for 2 months. The room was quiet. Every piece of land in this valley has low spots, she said. Most of you have written them off as problem areas. Wet in spring, useless in summer. But wet in spring means clay near the surface, and clay near the surface means you can build a pond. She paused, looked at the room. Dale Birch is going to dig his slough this winter, she said. I'm going to help him. If anyone else wants to know how to work their low ground, I'll come and look at it. She sat down. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. It went on for 2 hours. Not all of it was constructive. Pratt, the newer homesteader, asked a series of questions that suggested he was not entirely clear on how clay behaved and needed some foundational education that the room was not entirely patient to provide. One of the Macaulay brothers got into an argument with Ernest Whitmore about whether the water table on the North Ridge was the same as the water table on the valley floor, which was a real question but was taking the meeting in a direction that didn't serve anyone. Sid Pulver said nothing for the first hour, and then said one precise, devastating thing about the uselessness of talking versus digging, and then went back to silence, which frankly was Sid's most useful mode. Maris answered questions when they were directed at her and stayed quiet when they weren't. She corrected 2 factual errors about clay properties without letting the corrections become lectures. She told 3 people separately, at different moments, that she'd be happy to walk their low ground with them if they wanted. It was Odell Cooper who brought it to the point where it needed to end up. He waited until the room had talked itself mostly out, waited with the patience of a man who has learned, possibly recently, that speaking first isn't always the same as speaking well. Then he stood up, which quieted things down because Odell Cooper standing up in a room still commanded attention, even in a year when he'd sold most of his cattle. I want to say something, he said. He looked at Maris. She looked back. I have the biggest spread in this valley, he said, and I have the biggest low ground, the north basin of my property, the section I've been plowing under every spring and getting nothing from for 15 years. It's bigger than Miss Rowan's hollow. Better clay, too, if I'm being honest about what I saw walking it last week. A pause. The room was paying attention in a specific way. I'm going to put in a pond, he said. A real one. 3, maybe 4 times the size of the hollow. I've got the hands, or I will, when I rebuild the outfit next spring. And I want to do it right. He looked at Maris. I'd like your help. Maris did not immediately answer. She was thinking several things at once. She was thinking about a horse blocking a road. She was thinking about girl. She was thinking about the 3-word note, I am obliged, and about Margaret's face at the kitchen table and at the pond in the rain. She was thinking about Lucy Whitmore drinking from a clean barrel, and about Sid Pulver's 4 eggs, and about Torn's second clutch hatching into the rain. She was also thinking about the size of a pond 3 or 4 times the hollow, and what that would mean for the valley in the next drought year, and the one after that. "Yes," she said. Odell nodded. He sat back down, and something in the room shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way of storybooks where everything resolves clean and loud. Just quietly. The way a room changes when the hardest thing that needed to be said has been said, and the conversation can move forward. Dale Birch caught her eye from across the room and gave a small nod. She looked back at her notebook. After the meeting broke up, when people were filing out into the cold October night and the lanterns were being turned down one by one, Clara Foss found Maris near the barn door and fell in beside her without ceremony. They walked out together into the dark, breath fogging. "That went better than it could have," Clara said. "It went about how I expected," Maris said. "Odell surprised you." It wasn't a question. Maris considered lying out of habit and then decided against it. "A little," she admitted. "He surprised himself, I think," Clara said. "That's usually how it goes with men like him. They have to arrive at the right place on their own schedule, and there's nothing to be done about it except wait." They walked for a moment in silence. "Your mother would have talked half those people into a stupor," Clara said. "She could out-argue a courthouse full of lawyers on her worst day. You're quieter than she was." Maris looked at her. "You knew her well." "Since before you were born." Clara pulled her coat tighter. "She talked about that hollow, not often, but when she did, she had a particular look on her face that I could never quite read, like she knew something she wasn't ready to say yet." They had reached the point where their paths diverged, Clara's mule tied to the left post, Percy to the right. "Did she ever tell you why she kept the option on it?" Maris asked. "For 11 years without saying anything?" Clara untied her mule and stood for a moment. "She said she was waiting for the right person to use it." Maris went very still. "She meant you," Clara said. "In case that wasn't clear." She climbed up onto the mule with the efficiency of a woman who has been mounting mules in the dark for decades. "Good night, Maris." "Good night, Clara." She rode off down the dark road, and Maris stood by Percy for a long time before untying him. The cedar box was at the back of the shelf in her building, behind the spare lamp oil and a tin of matches. She hadn't opened it since the spring. She kept telling herself she'd go through it properly, sort through her mother's few papers, understand what was there. She'd been avoiding it. She knew that. Some things you leave closed until you have the strength for what's inside. She untied Percy and rode home through the dark valley, the creek running again to her left, the sound of water moving over stones so ordinary and so welcome she could have listened to it for hours. She opened the cedar box that night, sat on the edge of her bunk with the lamp turned up full, and went through it piece by piece. The coins. Fewer than she'd thought, but she'd already known that. A letter from her aunt in Missouri that predated Maris's letter, which meant her mother had been corresponding with the aunt about Maris's future without mentioning it. That stung a little, and she set it aside. A photograph she'd seen before, her parents before. The hard years had marked them, standing in front of a building she didn't recognize with the formal stillness of people who've been told not to move. And at the bottom, under everything else, another folded piece of paper. Not the deed. She'd taken the deed out the night she'd found it, and it had never gone back in. Something else. Folded the same number of times, the same soft creases. She unfolded it. Her mother's handwriting. Dated March 1879, which was 3 years before Maris's father died, 8 years before this summer. To whoever finds this with the deed. And then below it, a description of the hollow. Its location, its dimensions, the clay composition as her mother had assessed it, the natural drainage pattern she'd observed over multiple visits. The note went on for 2 pages in her mother's careful hand, dense with observation and detail, the record of someone who had studied a piece of land the way Maris had studied her pond, walking it, pressing the soil, watching the water, learning its logic. At the end of the second page, 3 sentences. The hollow is not worthless. It is waiting. The right season and the right hands will show what it is. Maris read those 3 sentences 4 times. She sat with the paper in her hands for a while, in the small lamp-lit room, with the creek running outside and the pond full, and the birds settled on the water, and the whole complicated, impossible machinery of the summer just completed, arranged around her in the dark. Her mother had known. Not everything. She hadn't foreseen the drought, hadn't planned for the eggs or the nests or the families coming for water, but she'd seen the land's possibility clearly enough to hold it for 11 years against the day someone would know what to do with it. She'd been waiting for Maris to grow into it. Maris folded the paper and put it back in the cedar box and closed the lid. She did not cry this time. She was past that particular expression of grief, or maybe just too tired to reach it. She sat for a while longer, then turned down the lamp and lay back in the bunk. She slept better that night than she had since May. November came in cold and honest, which was an improvement over the summer's heat, but presented its own negotiations. The pond's surface had a skin of ice on the still mornings that the birds broke through with what seemed like personal offense, and the water level stabilized at a depth Maris considered sufficient, but watched carefully. The ducks that were going south were going now, small groups lifting off at dawn, organizing themselves briefly over the hollow, and then banking away. And she tracked the departures in the notebook the way she'd tracked the arrivals, because this too was information. The ones that stayed surprised her. Torn stayed. Not just stayed, settled in with a permanence that suggested the bird had made a decision, which Maris understood was anthropomorphizing but found she didn't particularly care about on the philosophical level. Torn and her drake and 6 of the season's ducklings, who were full ducks now, and a handful of the newcomers who had apparently decided that this pond in this hollow in Callaway County, Wyoming, was a reasonable place to winter. 18 birds as of the 1st of November. She wrote it down. She was deep in her preparations for winter, laying in what she could afford, patching the north wall's loose board finally, cutting and stacking the firewood she should have done in August but hadn't, because August had been something else entirely. When Dale Birch appeared at the property line on a Saturday morning with both his oldest boys and a wagon full of tools. "We're ready to start the slough," he said. She looked at the tools. 2 long-handled spades, a mattock, a pair of sledgehammers, and a wooden mallet that looked like a cousin of the one she'd made from a juniper branch back in July. "The ground's going to be hard," she said. "I know. Boys are strong." He looked at his sons, who had the expressions of people who have been told they're strong often enough to suspect they're about to be asked to prove it in an inconvenient way. "And I've got time. The fields are done for the year." They started that day. She walked them through it, the same principles she'd applied to the hollow, but adapted to the specifics of Dale's slough, which was larger and had better natural drainage on the west side that needed to be accounted for. Dale's oldest boy, whose name was Thomas, and who had been quietly paying attention since the day he'd pretended to fix a fence post during her conversation with his father, asked good questions. Better than good. He had an instinctive sense for where water wanted to go, could look at a slope and read it the way some people read text. "You've got an eye for this," Maris told him at one point, not thinking about it, just saying what was true. Thomas went red in the way of 17-year-olds who have been told something that matters to them. "Dad says you've been studying water management for years," he said. "I read some pamphlets," she said, "and I spent a summer paying attention." "That's most of it, isn't it? The paying attention." She looked at him. "Most of what?" "Most of knowing something. It's mostly just looking at the same thing long enough to see what's there." She thought about her mother with a measuring stick in the hollow, alone, 8 years before this summer, pressing her palm into the clay, making notes on a paper she folded and put at the bottom of a cedar box. "Yes," she said, "that's most of it." The valley had a particular feeling in those November weeks, working toward winter, that was different from the feeling it had carried all summer. The summer's feeling had been compression, everything pressing in, getting smaller, the horizon of possibility contracting by the week. This feeling was different. Not exactly expansion, because the land was going dormant and the sky was short and cold, and expansion was the wrong word for the season. But something related to it, a sense of direction that had been missing. 3 families had come to her in October and November, asking her to walk their low ground. She'd done it for all 3. The Whitmore's East Depression, a swampy corner of the Macaulay sheep property that the brothers had been draining for years in completely the wrong direction, and a homestead on the south end of the valley owned by a family named Garvey who'd bought in spring and were still finding out what they had. Each piece of land was different. That was the thing she kept trying to explain to people who wanted a formula, a specific set of steps they could follow to get the same result she'd gotten. There wasn't a formula. There was looking, and there was thinking, and there was the particular arithmetic of that specific piece of ground on that specific water table. You couldn't transpose the Hollow's solution onto the Whitmore property any more than you could wear someone else's boots and expect them to fit. But the principles were the same. Clay behavior was clay behavior. Water, given a reason to stay, stayed. Depth preserved itself where shallowness didn't. She explained this differently to different people. To Ernest Whitmore, who was methodical and responded to step by step, she explained the process in order. To old Macaulay, who had been working land for 40 years and didn't like being taught things, she framed it as a question. What do you think would happen if you redirected that drainage east instead of west? And let him arrive at the answer himself, which he did, with the satisfaction of a man who believes he's figured something out on his own. To young Thomas Birch, who came and asked questions sometimes when she was at the slough and his father wasn't around, she talked about it differently still. She talked about observation as a skill, about the notebook, about the practice of writing things down, not because you might forget, but because the act of writing forces you to see what you're actually looking at versus what you expect to see. "You're teaching," Clara Foss said one afternoon, appearing at the pond's edge the way she sometimes appeared, without warning, without noise, just suddenly present the way certain very settled people can be. "I'm answering questions," Maris said. "That's teaching." Maris looked at the pond. "I don't know enough to teach." "Nobody who knows enough to teach thinks they do," Clara said. "That's not a flaw in you, it's how it works." She sat down on the large flat stone that had become, over the course of the summer, a reliable place to sit at the pond's edge. "Thomas Birch is going to be a farmer worth something someday, because of what you're telling him." Maris didn't answer. "You going to spend another winter on 40 acres of clay hollow?" Clara asked. "It's not just clay anymore," Maris said. "The South Bank has cattail coming in, and the sedge is spreading." "That's not what I asked." Maris looked at her. "What are you asking?" "Whether you're satisfied," Clara said, "with this, whether you want more or different, or whether this is the size of the life you want." It was the most personal thing Clara had ever said to her directly, and it landed differently than Maris expected. Not as an intrusion, but as something close to care. The kind of question only someone who is paying real attention asks. She thought about it honestly, sat with it. "I don't know yet," she said. "I've been too busy surviving to know what I want." "Fair enough," Claire said. "Winter's a good time to find out." She found out some of it. Not all. She doubted you found out all of anything in a single winter, and she was suspicious of people who claimed otherwise. But some. She wanted the pond to continue. That was clear to her, had been clear since May, but she could say it more firmly now. Not as a strategy or a survival measure, but as a thing she genuinely wanted in the way you want things that have become part of who you are. The birds, the water, the particular morning work of checking nests and reading tracks and writing numbers in the notebook. She wanted that. She wanted to help with the slough projects. That surprised her a little, the wanting of it. She'd offered help to the Birches and the others because it was right and useful, not because she'd thought she'd want to be doing it. But she did. There was something in watching Thomas Birch's face when he understood something about water and clay that was distinct from the satisfaction of her own work. Harder to name, more expansive. She did not want to go to Missouri to her aunt's reasonable prospects. That one she'd known for a while. She wrote most of this in the notebook, not in the careful column format she used for egg counts and water levels, but in the margins, in the smaller handwriting she used when she was thinking rather than recording. She had not used the notebook margins before. She went back and looked at the early entries, the tight, efficient field notes of a woman focused entirely on survival, and compared them to the November entries where her thoughts were crowding into every available space. It was a different notebook now, or she was a different reader of it. On a Tuesday in the middle of November, Maris rode to the Cooper property for the first time by invitation. Not to deliver water, the rain had fixed the Coopers' immediate crisis, and Odell was already talking to a well digger about relocating the main well to a better site on the property. She rode out because Odell had sent a note, properly addressed this time, 3 sentences instead of 3 words, asking if she'd be willing to walk the North Basin with him and give her assessment. She went. The North Basin of the Cooper property was, as Odell had said, bigger than her hollow. Considerably bigger. The clay subsoil was excellent. She could tell by the way the post-rain earth behaved underfoot, the particular resistance of it, the way it held the shape of her boot print without crumbling. Odell walked with her without talking much, which was a mode she'd not seen him in before. He watched where she looked, watched what she stopped to examine, and asked questions that were short and specific and took her answers seriously. "You're thinking 4 feet minimum depth," he said at one point. "At the center, yes. The banks can shallow out, but the center needs to hold enough volume to last through 6 weeks without rain, minimum." He nodded. "What did yours hold at its lowest?" "About 3 feet at center. It got lower than I'd have liked at the worst of August." She looked at the basin's natural dimensions. "Yours could hold twice the volume of mine. You'd have margin I didn't have." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have done this 10 years ago." Maris said nothing. "I'm not asking for your agreement," he said. "I'm just saying it." "All right," she said. They walked back toward the main buildings in the thin November light, boots crackling on the frost in the low spots. "I've been thinking about what you said at the meeting," Odell said. "About every low spot in the valley." "Yes. I've got 3 of them on this property. This is the biggest, but there are 2 smaller ones, one to the east and one along the south fence line." "I saw the south one from the road," she said. "It's shallower, but it's workable." He stopped walking and looked at her. "What would it take to put in all 3? She looked at him steadily. "Time. Labor. The right season. Spring, after the ground softens. And someone willing to pace it right, not rush the clay packing. I've got hands in the spring. Not as many as I had, but enough." He paused. "I'd pay for your time. Properly." She had not been expecting that either. The summer had been full of unexpected things from Odell Cooper, and she was still developing her calibration for them. "We can talk about that," she said, which was not a yes and not a no, which was apparently where she was on the question. He nodded, as if that were the answer he'd expected. They walked back to the house, and Margaret met them at the door, fully herself now in the way that had emerged slowly since the illness. Her old certainty still there, but wearing it differently, like a coat that's been taken in slightly at the shoulders. She offered Maris coffee, which was not nothing given the price of coffee in the valley right now. Maris accepted. They sat at the same kitchen table where she'd assessed Margaret's illness in September, and the 3 of them talked about the North Basin and the spring work. And it was strange and matter-of-fact and not comfortable exactly, but genuinely all right, which Maris thought was probably the best you could reasonably expect from people who had started the summer the way they had. Margaret asked about the ducks once, toward the end, whether the birds that had stayed would be there come spring, whether they'd nest again. She asked it with an offhandedness that didn't quite conceal the fact that she actually wanted to know. "Torn will nest again," Maris said. "The ones who chose this hollow, they tend to come back." "Torn," Margaret said. "The mallard with the torn wing feather. I've been tracking her." Margaret looked at Odell. Odell looked at his coffee. "You tracked a specific duck," Margaret said. "For observation purposes," Maris said. A pause. Then Margaret said, "Of course you did." And there was something in it that was not quite the old edge, not quite warmth, but something in between that might have been the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. Maris drank her coffee and let it be what it was. She rode back to the hollow in the late afternoon, the sun low and orange over the limestone rise, Percy working at his usual philosophical pace. The valley spread out below and around her in the long light, the creek running silver in the cut below the road, the fields brown and resting, a scatter of homestead buildings with their wood smoke rising. It looked different than it had in May. That first day she'd ridden into Greer with the deed in both hands and the sum of her mother's savings in her pocket and the laughter of the street behind her. The valley had looked the same fields, same buildings, same limestone ridges north and south, but she had looked at it as a stranger looks at a place. From outside. With the knowledge that she was going to try something nobody here thought was worth trying, and the absolute uncertainty about whether she was right. She was not outside it anymore. She couldn't have said exactly when that had changed. Not one moment. More like a gradual turning, the way seasons turn, where you notice it's happened without being able to point to when. Percy turned off the road onto the hollow's path without prompting. She let him. He knew the way. The pond was still in the early evening light, the remaining ducks gathered at the south end in their loose, comfortable clusters. Torn was where she usually was at this hour, near the sedge at the base of the limestone, which was her preferred roosting spot. The frost had come up in the margins of the bank, a thin white fringe, and the cattail the south bank had started producing showed dark against it. Maris dismounted and tied Percy to the post she'd put in for that purpose back in August, and walked to the pond's edge. She stood there for a while. She was 26 years old and she had 40 acres of clay hollow and a pond full of ducks and a notebook full of numbers and a cedar box with her mother's note at the bottom of it. She had given water to 9 families and eggs to 8, and she had the beginnings of something that was going to take years to understand the full dimensions of, years she would have to work and make mistakes in and figure things out the hard way, the way she'd always figured things out. She had not fixed anything, not permanently, not cleanly. The valley would have another drought, and it would be hard, and some things would fail, and some people would make the same mistakes they'd made this time. That was the nature of things, and she was not naive enough to think one summer had changed it fundamentally. But the north basin of the Cooper property was going to be dug in spring. Dale Birch's slough was half dug already, sitting under its first frost waiting for Thomas's shovel come March. The Whitmore East Depression had been walked and assessed, and Ernest had written down the measurements in a notebook of his own, a new one Maris had noticed he'd started keeping. 3 more properties had been walked and thought about. The hollow was not a secret anymore. The hollow was a fact the valley knew about, and the fact had changed how some people looked at their own land. That was the thing. That was the durable thing. Not the eggs, not the water. Those were real and necessary, and she didn't undervalue them. But what outlasted the crisis was the looking. The particular quality of attention that the summer had required and produced, and was now, haltingly, spreading. She crouched at the pond's edge and pressed her palm flat against the clay bank. Cold, solid, packed by months of her own hands and the weight of the water above it. Torn looked at her from across the water with the bright, calm, non-committal eye of a bird that does not assign meaning to human gesture, but has learned to read it for threat level and found this particular human, in this particular place, to consistently register as safe. "Same time next spring," Maris said. Torn dipped her head under the water, came back up, righted herself. Maris stood and went to take care of Percy before the light gave out completely. Winter in Wyoming doesn't ask permission. It arrives the same way the drought did, committed, total, indifferent to whatever plans you'd made. By December, the hollow was locked under 6 inches of ice, and the birds had arranged themselves around its edges with the patience of creatures that understand waiting in a way humans keep having to relearn. Torn was still there. Maris checked every morning. She had a routine now that was different from the summer's routine in a way that felt important. Summer had been pure reaction, the urgent, daily arithmetic of keeping something alive under conditions designed to kill it. Winter was something else. Winter was the first time since May that she had space to think forward instead of just through. She thought about the Cooper North Basin. Odell had sent another note in late November, 2 pages this time, with rough measurements he'd taken himself and a sketch of the property's drainage lines that was amateur but showed genuine observation. She'd written back with corrections and suggestions and found herself interested in the correspondence in a way she hadn't expected. Odell Cooper with a measuring stick and a piece of paper was a different kind of problem than Odell Cooper on a horse blocking a road. And she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that the difference mattered to her, and the annoyance wasn't holding the way it had. Thomas Birch came by the hollow twice a week through December. Not always with questions. Sometimes he just came and stood at the ice edge and looked at the birds and didn't say much. Maris let him do that without making it into something. She'd had enough years of needing to stand somewhere and look at something without being asked to explain why, to know that the need was real and the silence around it was a gift. One Thursday, he came with a book. Held it out to her without preamble, a water management text, dense and technical, published by an agricultural college in Ohio. The spine was cracked, pages marked with strips of paper. "Ordered it from the catalog," he said. "Thought you might want to read it." She looked at the book, then at him. "Where'd you find the catalog listing?" Asked Gus Greer if he could order a book on water and clay, and he found it. He shrugged, which was his primary mode of communicating things he felt strongly about. "It's got a whole chapter on pond construction in arid climates." She opened it, read the first page of the chapter, looked up. This is exactly what I was trying to work out by hand last summer, she said. I know. He almost smiled. You figured out most of it anyway. She kept the book. She read it in the evenings by lamplight, and what she found was that her instincts had been sound and her methods had been roughly correct. And there were three things she'd done inefficiently that she could correct in spring. The bank angle on the east side, the placement of the deepest point relative to the natural drainage, and the way she'd been packing clay, which was functional but not optimal. She wrote these corrections in the notebook margins in her smaller handwriting, cross-referenced with page numbers from Thomas's book, and went to bed feeling the particular satisfaction of finding out you were mostly right and knowing exactly where you were wrong. That was a good winter feeling. She held on to it. January brought the kind of cold that closes conversations down to essentials. People didn't travel unless they had to, didn't visit, barely sent word. The valley contracted into itself, each family inside its four walls with its firewood and its food stores and whatever it had managed to put by before the ground froze. Maris had enough, not comfortably enough. She was eating carefully, rationing the cornmeal and the dried beans and the preserved plums from Ernest Whitmore that she'd stretched across 3 months. But enough, which was more than some people in the valley had, and she knew it. She sewed, she read. She wrote long entries in the notebook about what she planned to do in spring and why, and she read them back and argued with herself about them, and changed things, and sometimes changed them back. She went through her mother's papers properly, finally, the whole cedar box, everything, and built a picture of a woman she'd thought she knew well and kept discovering she'd underestimated. Her mother had corresponded with 3 different agricultural societies. She'd kept notes from a lecture she'd attended in Kansas City in 1881 about water retention in arid climates, notes so thorough they amounted to a transcription. She'd sketched drainage maps of 4 different properties she'd apparently assessed at some point, including one that Maris recognized as the Macaulay sheep property on the North Ridge. The woman had been looking at land the way Maris looked at land for longer than Maris had been alive. She sat with this for several evenings, turned it over. There was grief in it, the familiar grief of discovering depth in a person after they can't confirm it, when you have to hold the understanding alone. But there was also something else, not comfort exactly, something like company. Like the work she was doing had roots she hadn't known to look for, and now that she saw them, the work felt differently grounded. She was not the first Rowan woman to look at a piece of land and see what it could hold. She wrote that in the notebook, too. Spring came late and wet and argumentative, the way Wyoming springs do, and the valley emerged from winter with the dazed, cautious energy of people who have survived something and aren't entirely sure yet what it means for what comes next. The first morning, Maris walked the hollow's perimeter and found the ice fully gone from the pond. April 9th, she noted it. Torn was there. She almost didn't believe it at first. The bird was in the same spot at the sedge near the limestone base, and when Maris came around the north end and the bird came into view, she stopped and looked for the torn feather on the left wing and found it. Same bird, same spot. Returned. She stood there for a moment doing nothing useful. Then she opened the notebook and wrote 4-9, torn back, Drake present. South bank cleared for nesting. She started the pond's spring maintenance that same week. There were sections of bank that had heaved with frost and needed repacking. A section of the east margin where ice damage had undermined the clay wall and left a slump she didn't like. She worked it methodically, the familiar labor of it back in her hands and shoulders, like a language she'd been away from long enough to miss. Thomas Birch appeared on the 3rd day and helped without asking if help was wanted, which she appreciated. They worked side by side in the April mud for 3 days, Thomas handling the mattock work on the damaged east margin with a competence that no longer surprised her but still registered. He'd been practicing over the winter on the slow, which his father had kept him at through the short thaw periods, and which was now, by his account, holding its shape well. "Dad says we should start filling it in May," Thomas said, pausing to wipe his forehead. "Once the creek is reliable." "That's right," Maris said. "Don't force it earlier. You want the banks fully set before you load them with water." I told him that. He's impatient. "Tell him I said so too." Thomas looked at her sidelong. "Does that carry weight?" She thought about it honestly. "More than it used to," she said. He went back to work, and she went back to work, and the pond's east margin was sound by the end of the 3rd day. The Cooper North Basin project began on the 15th of May. It was not a small undertaking. Odell had 4 hands by spring, rebuilt part of his outfit on a leaner model than before but functional, and they were serious workers under serious supervision. The basin itself was larger than she'd estimated from walking it in November, closer to twice the hollow's area than the 3 to 4 times Odell had claimed, but the clay was excellent and the natural contour of the land gave them advantages her hollow hadn't had. Maris was there 3 days of the first week and twice a week after that. She was being paid for it. They'd worked out a figure in April that she'd pushed back on as too high, and Odell had pushed back on her pushback with the particular stubbornness of a man making a point about something that isn't really about money. And she'd accepted because she needed what it represented more than she needed to be difficult about it. She did not think of herself as Odell Cooper's employee. She thought of herself as the person who knew something he needed to know, which was a cleaner arrangement, and the one that was actually true. Margaret came out to the North Basin twice. The first time she stood at the edge and looked and asked 2 practical questions about bank angles that told Maris she'd been listening to Odell's descriptions carefully. The second time she came alone, on a Tuesday afternoon, when Odell was in town and the hands were working the south end of the basin and Maris was checking the clay packing on the north wall. She came and stood nearby and didn't say anything for a while. "I've been thinking," Margaret said finally. "All right," Maris said. "About last summer, what I said in town." She paused. "About the water. You apologized for that," Maris said. "In October, at the pond." "I know. I'm not apologizing again. I'm thinking about why I said it." Maris stopped what she was doing and looked at her. Margaret was looking at the half-dug basin, at the raw clay walls and the men working at the far end, and the shape of what this place was becoming. "I didn't like that you'd seen something we hadn't," she said. "That's really what it was, not the water being dirty. I didn't like being wrong, and I didn't like that you were right, and so I looked for reasons you weren't." She said it flatly, like something she'd been rehearsing enough to get the sentiment and emotion out of it, so what was left was just the plain fact. "That's an ugly thing to say about yourself." "It's an honest thing," Maris said. Margaret looked at her. "You're not going to tell me it's fine?" "No." "Good." A pause. "I'm glad you're not going to tell me it's fine." They stood in the thin May sun for a moment. The clay smell was sharp and good, the smell of opened earth, of something being made. "The Whitmore baby is walking," Margaret said. She'd shifted, changed footing, the way she did when a subject was closed and a new one was starting. "I saw them in town last week. Lucy, she's walking." "Ernest mentioned that," Maris said. She went back to checking the clay packing. "He started a notebook." "Ernest Whitmore is keeping a notebook?" "About his East Depression, water levels, drainage patterns." She pressed her palm against the wall. "He's a careful observer when he slows down enough." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You've changed things here," she said. "I don't mean the ponds, I mean the way people are looking at their land." She said it without particular warmth and without resentment, just as an observation, which was about the most genuine thing Margaret Holt could offer, and Maris knew it. "People change themselves," Maris said. "I just walked some low ground with them." Margaret made a sound that was not agreement and not argument, just acknowledgement. She left shortly after, without ceremony, and Maris watched her go across the dry spring grass toward her horse and thought about what it meant when the person who started as the loudest objection to everything you were doing became, without either of you planning it, something adjacent to an ally. It didn't have a clean name. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, because forgiveness was a transaction, and this was something more ongoing, more unresolved, more honest. It was just what happened when people live near each other long enough and the circumstances force them to keep revising their opinions whether they want to or not. She went back to the clay wall. By midsummer, the Cooper North Basin was finished and filling. It held on the first try. The clay was as good as she'd assessed, the bank angles were right, and the first week of July brought 3 days of solid rain that pushed the water level to a depth that made Maris's chest feel something when she stood at the edge and looked at it. Odell stood beside her on the day they both walked the full perimeter of the completed pond. It was bigger than she'd imagined, standing in the hollow, looking at 40 acres of clay and cracked grass the previous spring. Not beautiful. She'd never found that word useful for land, which was not beautiful or ugly, but simply what it was. But solid. Real. The kind of thing that would still be here in 20 years. First birds came in last night, Odell said. 2 of them landed just before dark. She looked at him. Did you go out to check? Margaret did, he said. She woke me up to tell me. Maris looked back at the water. 2 mallards, Odell said, just sitting there on the water. She let herself smile at that, the small private kind that didn't require anyone else to see it. They stood at the bank for a while, not saying anything, and the silence between them was not the silence of May on that road in Greer, not the silence of 2 people who couldn't speak to each other without the weight of what they'd each already decided about the other. It was just the silence of 2 people standing next to something they'd built, one of whom had known what it would be and one of whom had taken a long time to believe her. There's going to be another drought, Odell said. Maybe not next year, but eventually. Yes, Maris said. We'll be ready this time. She looked at the water, at the mallards moving near the far bank, at the sky above the basin, which was the same enormous, indifferent Wyoming sky it had always been, not kinder or crueler than it had ever been, just itself. Some of us will, she said, and the ones who are will help the ones who aren't. He thought about that. That work this time? More than I expected, she said honestly. He nodded. More than I deserved, he said, and it was quiet enough that she almost didn't hear it, and she did not look at him when he said it, and neither of them made it into more than what it was. The summer of 1888 was dry again, but not catastrophically. The kind of dry that reminded you what the previous summer had been, while stopping short of repeating it. The creek ran low, but ran. The wells dropped, but not to brackish. The families who had put in ponds or begun preparing their low ground had margin that they hadn't had before. The ones who hadn't were uncomfortable but not desperate. Maris spent the summer differently than she'd spent the previous one. She still hauled water when it was needed. She still tracked the pond, still read the birds, still kept the notebook with the same regularity she'd kept it all year. Torn produced a clutch in June, 7 eggs, 4 of which hatched, the other 3 apparently lost to some disturbance in the night that she found evidence of in the morning without finding the cause. That was the nature of things. 4 out of 7. You took what held. But she also rode out to 4 different properties and consulted on water management questions. She helped the Macaulay brothers redirect their slope drainage in a way that finally made sense of a wet corner they'd been fighting for a decade and turned it into something functional. She sat with Ernest Whitmore for 2 hours going over his notebook and his East Depression plans, and pointed out 2 places where his clay assessment was off, and 1 place where his instinct was better than he realized. She was being paid for some of this now. Not much. This was not a wealthy valley, and nobody was overpaying anybody for anything, but something. Enough that she bought Percy a proper saddle blanket in July, which he seemed to regard with suspicion, but accepted. She also, for the first time since moving to the Hollow, went to a social event voluntarily. The Birch family held a gathering in late July, a working party that turned into a celebration when the slough filled properly for the first time. A moment Thomas described to her later with the controlled excitement of a 17-year-old trying not to seem as thrilled as he was. Dale had killed a hog, and there was food, actual food, the kind of abundance that felt meaningful after the previous summer's scarcity, and about 15 people came and ate and talked in the long summer evening. Maris sat with Clara Foss for most of it, which was where she was most comfortable, and watched the valley come together around a table in a way it hadn't managed in the summer of the drought, because drought doesn't bring people together. It isolates them, drives them into their own surviving, makes the world as small as their own property line. Water brought people together. The having of it, the sharing of it, the building of it. That was the thing she kept arriving at when she thought about what the summer had actually been. "You're thinking," Clara said beside her. "I'm always thinking," Maris said. "You're thinking about something specific." "I'm thinking about whether any of this lasts." She watched Thomas across the yard, deep in conversation with the Garvey boy from the south end of the valley, both of them crouched, looking at something in the dirt that was probably a drainage question. Whether the next drought finds people better off, or whether they go back to what they were doing. "Some will," Clara said. "Some people are just going to keep farming the same way until it kills them." "And the others?" Clara looked at Thomas, at Ernest Whitmore talking with his wife, at Dale Birch, standing at the edge of his repaired slough in the long evening light, looking at the water with the expression of a man who has been converted to something and is still getting used to the feeling. The others have water they made themselves, Clara said, and they know how they made it. That doesn't go away. Maris thought about that for a while. About knowledge as a different kind of resource than water or eggs or food, one that doesn't get depleted when you share it, that actually moves in the other direction. The more you give it away, the more places it exists. She'd learned that from a woman who put a deed in a cedar box and a note at the bottom and waited. My mother left me that hollow, Maris said. I've been thinking about why she left it to me instead of just selling it. She needed the money more than she let on. I found that out going through her papers. She could have sold it any time. She was waiting for you to be old enough to know what to do with it, Clara said. That's what you said before. I said she was waiting for the right person. Same thing. Maris looked at her. You're saying she always knew it would be me. I'm saying she hoped, Clara said. She thought you had what was needed. She wasn't certain. You're never certain with children. They become people you didn't predict, sometimes better and sometimes not. She paused. She was right, as it turned out. But she couldn't have known that. She just hoped. Maris was quiet for a while. There was something in that word, hoped, that landed differently than certainty would have. Certainty would have been a burden, the weight of a destiny already decided. Hope was something else. Hope was a bet placed on a person by someone who loved them, knowing they might be wrong, placing it anyway. Her mother had held that hollow for 11 years on hope. Maris had earned it on a summer of labor and doubt and 43 eggs and buckets of water hauled from a limestone seep in the worst heat of a Wyoming drought. That seemed about right. That seemed like the correct proportion of things. She did not leave the hollow. People asked, over the course of that second year, in various ways, whether she'd thought about expanding, buying more land, moving somewhere more central, setting herself up more formally as someone people paid for water management advice. Odell Cooper suggested it in the fall. A man from the county seat wrote her a letter that someone at the Valley meeting must have passed her name along to, asking if she'd be interested in consulting on a project 2 counties east. She thought about it. She was honest enough with herself to think about it properly, not to dismiss it out of habit or false modesty, but actually sit with the question of whether she wanted more than what she had. She didn't, or not yet, or not that kind of more. What she wanted was the hollow. The pond, the birds, the notebook, the particular quality of a morning when the air was still and the water was smooth and Torn was in her spot, and the whole enterprise was exactly what it had been the day the first 2 mallards landed, and she'd exhaled for the first time in weeks. She wanted to keep walking low ground with people who were starting to look at their land differently. She wanted to keep answering Thomas Birch's questions, which were getting better every month and would probably surpass hers in some categories within a few years, which she found she was looking forward to rather than threatened by. She wanted to be here for the next drought, which would come, and to have the valley be better for it than it had been for the last one. Those were the things she wanted. They fit inside 40 acres and a small building and a notebook that was almost full and would need a second one soon. On a September morning, the second September she'd lived at the hollow, she walked the full perimeter of the pond in the early light the way she did every morning. Checked the bank margins, checked the water level, counted the birds, noted the condition of the nesting areas. Torn was there, the drake beside her, both of them going about their morning with the unhurried purpose of creatures that are exactly where they belong. She stood at the south bank and looked at the water and tried to see it the way she'd seen it on the first day. The muddy, shallow basin, the cracked clay, the single crow on the dead juniper. The thing everyone had said was worthless. She couldn't quite get back to that seeing. The way the pond was now had overwritten it too completely. What she saw was what it had become, which was the result of one summer's specific and stubborn work, which was water that had fed birds and birds that had fed families, and families that had fed each other, and a valley that had started, slowly and imperfectly, and with significant resistance along the way, to learn something new about itself. Not a transformation. She was suspicious of the word transformation, which implied things were different in a clean and lasting way, and usually they were just different in the ways they were different, which was real, but messier and more contingent than transformation suggested. The valley had not been transformed. It had been stretched a little, pushed in a direction it hadn't gone before. Some of the people in it had changed, some hadn't, and the ones who had would be tested again the next time. Things got hard and might fail the test in ways they hadn't failed this time. And that was the truth of people. that they are not finished learning the things they know, and the knowing doesn't stick the same way in every condition. But the ponds were real. The clay walls she'd packed and the ones Dale Birch's boys had packed, and the ones that Odell Cooper's hands had put in on the North Basin. Those were real, and they would hold water, and the water would matter. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, in fact, everything. She turned and walked back toward her building where the lamp was still lit from the morning, and Percy was expressing his views about breakfast at volume from his enclosure, and the second notebook was sitting on the table waiting for the day's first entry. She had work to do. She'd always had work to do. The difference was that now she knew what the work was for, and she had learned, the hard way, the only way that really sticks, that the land under your feet is never just what it looks like on the surface. It is what you're willing to look for inside it, what you're patient enough to find, what you're stubborn enough to build even when every voice around you has decided you're wrong. The crow was gone from the dead juniper. It had been gone since summer. The tree had fallen in a July storm, and the crow had found somewhere else to sit and regard the world with its particular skepticism, which was fine. The hollow didn't need the crow's opinion of it anymore. It knew